Every quiet neighborhood carries an invisible promise. The promise is simple and comforting: if a family lives honestly, raises their children with care, and treats others with dignity, the world will usually return that kindness. Most people believe that promise without questioning it. It is the silent agreement that holds communities together, the gentle assumption behind every friendly wave across a driveway and every polite smile exchanged at the school gate. But sometimes a story begins the moment that promise quietly breaks. And the most dangerous part is not the betrayal itself. The most dangerous part is when people believe they can control the story afterward. For many years, the life of Daniel Whitaker followed the calm rhythm that people associate with stability. His home sat on a quiet street in a modest suburban town where lawns were trimmed neatly and evening lights glowed warmly through front windows. The kind of place where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors greeted each other with familiar nods that required no long conversations. Daniel had built his life slowly and carefully. He was not a loud man and never tried to dominate a room with presence or authority. Instead, people trusted him because of something quieter. He listened more than he spoke. He watched situations carefully before forming conclusions. And when he did speak, his words carried a calm clarity that made others feel grounded. Those who knew him well often described him as patient. Not passive, but patient in a deliberate way. The kind of patience that comes from understanding that most truths reveal themselves over time. His daughter, Olivia Whitaker, was the center of that steady life. Olivia was 17, thoughtful, curious, and quietly determined about the future she wanted. She moved through the world with a gentle confidence that came from growing up in a home where her voice mattered. She was not the loudest student in her class, nor the most dramatic personality among her friends. But she carried something far more enduring: integrity. Her days followed a pattern that had become familiar over the years. Mornings began early with the quiet shuffle of books and notebooks across the kitchen table. The sunlight would stretch through the windows while Daniel reviewed the day's plans with calm attentiveness. There was rarely any rush. The house moved with a rhythm that felt intentional. School had always been a place where Olivia thrived. Her teachers often described her as focused and responsible. She approached her work carefully, rarely seeking attention, but always delivering results that reflected dedication. Her ambitions were clear. She dreamed about studying environmental science and eventually working in conservation. She believed in quiet contributions that could make the world better without needing recognition. The community around them reinforced that sense of stability. The high school was well regarded, known for its organized programs and disciplined environment. Parents trusted the administration. Teachers were respected. Students moved through predictable routines that gave families confidence in the system supporting their children. For years, Daniel had watched Olivia grow within that environment with quiet pride. He attended school events when he could, spoke respectfully with teachers, and remained involved without hovering too closely. His parenting philosophy had always been simple: guide gently, observe carefully, and step in only when truly necessary. But Daniel had another habit that few people noticed. He paid attention to small things. Not in a suspicious way, but in the manner of someone who understood that details often reveal deeper truths. A slight hesitation in someone's voice. A pause before answering a question. A piece of information that did not quite align with the rest of the picture. Most of the time, those details meant nothing. Life contains countless small inconsistencies that resolve themselves naturally. Until one day, a detail appeared that did not resolve itself. The first moment seemed almost too ordinary to matter. It arrived quietly through a piece of school paperwork that Olivia had brought home after an administrative meeting. The document looked routine, the kind of form that students collected throughout the year without much thought. Olivia placed it on the kitchen counter while organizing her backpack. Daniel glanced at it casually at first. Just another form among many others. But his eyes paused on one section that felt slightly unusual. The language used in the document was more formal than expected, referencing a situation that had not been previously discussed. Olivia herself seemed mildly confused by it. She explained that the school administration had asked several students to sign routine paperwork connected to a review process. No one had explained much beyond that. Daniel did not react immediately. Instead, he read the document again slowly. The wording suggested that a concern had already been documented within the school's internal system. But Daniel knew something important about Olivia's recent school life. Nothing had occurred that would justify such documentation. Still, the tone remained polite. No accusations appeared directly. The language was careful, almost protective in how it framed the situation. Anyone reading quickly might assume it was simply part of standard administrative procedure. Daniel folded the paper neatly and placed it back on the counter. He did not question Olivia aggressively. He did not contact the school that evening. And he did not express alarm. But something inside him had shifted. Over the next several days, small changes began appearing around the edges of normal life. When Daniel attended a routine parent meeting at the school, certain staff members greeted him with smiles that felt slightly too careful. Their voices carried an unusual tone of concern, though nothing specific was mentioned. The conversations remained polite. Respectful, even. Yet beneath those controlled expressions, Daniel sensed something unfamiliar. It was not hostility. It was not open judgment. It was something far more subtle. It felt like people were speaking from within a story that had already been written. And Olivia, though she could not fully explain why, began sensing it too. Teachers who had always spoken warmly now interacted with a measured professionalism that seemed slightly distant. Friends occasionally mentioned hearing small rumors that made little sense. Still, no one confronted the family directly. Everything remained calm on the surface. Smiles continued. School routines continued. Community life remained exactly the same. But Daniel Whitaker had spent enough years observing human behavior to recognize when the atmosphere of a situation begins to change. One quiet evening, after Olivia had gone upstairs to study, Daniel returned to the kitchen counter where the document still rested beneath a stack of school papers. He unfolded it once more. And this time, his attention focused on a single line near the bottom. A reference number. An internal case number. Daniel knew enough about institutional systems to understand what that meant. It meant this situation had already been formally recorded somewhere within the school's administrative files. Which raised one quiet, unavoidable question. If an official record already existed, then someone had started writing a story about his daughter. And Daniel Whitaker knew with absolute certainty that the document now sitting in his hands was not supposed to exist at all. There is a moment in certain situations when a person realizes something unsettling. The truth is no longer the most important thing in the room. What becomes more powerful is the version of events that people begin repeating. Once that version takes shape, it can travel quietly through conversations, meetings, and paperwork long before anyone pauses to ask whether it is actually correct. And the most difficult battles are not fought against loud accusations. They are fought against calm, confident stories that sound believable. Daniel Whitaker began to notice those stories forming in ways that were almost impossible to point to directly. Nothing about the school's behavior was openly hostile. In fact, every interaction appeared polite on the surface. Teachers greeted him with the same professional smiles they had always used. Administrators spoke with calm voices and reassuring tones. Every conversation carried the language of concern, responsibility, and care for students. But the subtle shifts were impossible for Daniel to ignore. During a routine school meeting the following week, the principal spoke about student well-being in a tone that sounded rehearsed. Certain phrases appeared more than once, as if they had been carefully chosen ahead of time. The conversation never directly accused anyone of wrongdoing, yet it created the quiet impression that a situation had already been understood and evaluated. Daniel listened more than he spoke. Across the room, Olivia sat beside him, flipping gently through the pages of a meeting packet. Her expression remained calm, but Daniel could see something unfamiliar in her posture. She seemed slightly withdrawn, as if trying to understand why the atmosphere around her felt different. After the meeting ended, several staff members approached them with warm smiles. Their words were kind. Their tone was measured. And yet each conversation carried the same subtle undertone, carefully framed concern that seemed to assume certain things had already happened. Daniel thanked them politely, offering calm responses without challenging anything directly. His voice remained steady, his manner respectful. To anyone observing the exchange, it would appear like a routine discussion between a parent and school officials. But inside his mind, Daniel was quietly taking note of patterns. He noticed how similar phrases appeared in different conversations. He noticed how people referenced situations without describing them clearly. He noticed the way certain questions were asked, as if they were designed to confirm a narrative rather than explore the truth. Most people would have brushed these moments aside. Daniel did not. That evening, after returning home, he opened his laptop at the kitchen table while Olivia worked on homework nearby. The house was quiet except for the soft rhythm of typing and the occasional turning of notebook pages. Daniel began organizing small pieces of information. He saved emails from the school. He recorded the dates of meetings that had taken place. He wrote short notes describing what had been said and who had said it. Each entry was brief and factual, without emotional commentary. He was not trying to prove anything yet. He was simply preserving clarity. Across the table, Olivia eventually looked up from her work. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, choosing her words carefully. Something about school felt different lately, though she could not explain why. Teachers who had once been relaxed now seemed unusually formal. Some classmates had begun asking quiet questions about situations she did not fully understand. None of it was dramatic. It was simply a collection of small moments that created a vague sense of discomfort. Daniel listened patiently. He did not dismiss her concerns, but he also did not react with alarm. Instead, he reassured her with the same calm presence he had always provided throughout her life. Situations sometimes become confusing before they become clear, he explained gently. The most important thing was to remain steady and honest. Olivia nodded, though uncertainty still lingered behind her eyes. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Teachers communicated with careful professionalism. Administrators occasionally mentioned internal reviews without providing specific details. Even casual interactions in the school hallway carried an unfamiliar layer of caution. To many people, these changes might have seemed insignificant. But Daniel understood something about human systems. Institutions rarely move quickly or emotionally. Instead, they create procedures, documentation, and structured narratives that allow decisions to appear orderly and justified. By the time the public sees the final version of events, much of the story has already been written quietly behind closed doors. That realization settled into Daniel's thoughts with quiet weight. This situation was no longer about a single misunderstanding. It was about how a narrative begins forming inside a system. And once that narrative exists, it can begin influencing every conversation that follows. Daniel continued documenting everything carefully. Each email was stored. Each meeting was summarized. Each new detail was added to a growing timeline that remained private on his computer. Outwardly, nothing about his behavior changed. He still greeted school staff with respect. He still attended meetings with calm attentiveness. He still encouraged Olivia to focus on her studies and daily routines. But internally, his understanding of the situation had shifted. This was no longer a moment that could be resolved through a quick conversation. Something larger was unfolding. And Daniel knew that reacting emotionally would only make it easier for others to dismiss his concerns. So he chose patience. He watched. He listened. He documented. The long game had begun, even though no one else seemed aware of it. One afternoon later that week, Olivia returned home carrying another set of school documents distributed during an administrative review session. She placed the papers on the kitchen table with mild confusion, explaining that several students had received updated reports related to the ongoing situation. Daniel picked up the document calmly and began reading. The report was written in professional language, filled with carefully structured statements about observations, evaluations, and procedural outcomes. To someone unfamiliar with the background, it would appear thorough and responsible. But as Daniel read each paragraph slowly, a deep stillness settled over him. Because the report described events that Olivia had never experienced. Not vaguely different. Completely different. By the time he reached the final page, one quiet realization became impossible to ignore. Somewhere within the school system, a version of the story had already been finalized. And that version did not resemble the truth at all. When people believe they control the story, they often assume no one is watching closely enough to question it. Stories move through systems quietly, through meeting notes, polite emails, official reports, and calm conversations that sound reasonable to anyone who hears them briefly. But stories written too quickly often leave small fingerprints behind. And Daniel Whitaker had spent enough years observing the world to understand something simple: truth rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself through details. The evening after reading the school report, Daniel sat alone at the dining table long after Olivia had gone upstairs. The house had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, the kind of silence that normally brought comfort after a long day. But that night, Daniel's mind was working with a different kind of focus. He opened his laptop and created a folder with a simple name. Inside it, he began placing every document connected to the situation surrounding his daughter. At first, the collection looked ordinary. Emails from school staff. Copies of meeting invitations. Notes taken during administrative conversations. The report Olivia had brought home. Nothing appeared dramatic when viewed individually. But Daniel was not looking at individual documents. He was studying patterns. His approach was calm and methodical, the same way someone might approach a complex puzzle. Each piece was placed carefully, not forced into conclusions before its time. He created a timeline that began weeks earlier, marking the first moment the unusual paperwork had appeared. Then he added each interaction that followed. Every email received from the school was saved and categorized. Each meeting summary was written down while the details were still fresh. Even small remarks that might seem insignificant were recorded with the date and context. Daniel never wrote anything emotional in these notes. Only facts. Meanwhile, life around them continued moving forward as if nothing unusual had happened. The school operated with its usual structure. Announcements were made over the morning intercom. Students moved between classrooms carrying books and laptops. Teachers assigned projects and discussed upcoming academic events. To most people in the community, the situation involving Olivia had already taken a quiet shape. Conversations about her were careful and controlled, but they carried the tone of something that had already been explained somewhere else. When her name appeared in discussion, people used measured language that sounded thoughtful yet distant, as if the details had already been reviewed by someone more qualified. Daniel noticed this tone during a parent gathering at the school auditorium. Several parents approached him with polite expressions and carefully chosen words. They spoke about how difficult situations sometimes arise in school communities. They mentioned how administrators work hard to maintain fairness and structure. None of them said anything directly about Olivia. But the message beneath their kindness was clear enough. Some version of events had already traveled quietly through the system. Daniel responded to every conversation with calm respect. He thanked people for their concern and assured them that his family was handling things thoughtfully. He never argued. He never corrected anyone publicly. Because he understood something important. Once a narrative begins spreading through a community, challenging it emotionally often strengthens it rather than weakening it. Instead, Daniel continued doing what he had started. Watching. Documenting. Understanding. At home, Olivia tried to maintain her usual routine, though Daniel could see how the uncertainty affected her in quiet ways. She still completed her assignments, still spoke about her future plans, still smiled during ordinary conversations. But sometimes she paused in the middle of a sentence, as if trying to process something that didn't quite make sense. Daniel never allowed the situation to dominate their evenings. They still shared dinner. They still discussed books, upcoming college applications, and ordinary moments from the day. Maintaining normal life became part of protecting her. Meanwhile, Daniel's timeline continued growing. As he reviewed the documents again and again, certain details began standing out more clearly. Dates that did not align. Reports that referenced meetings before those meetings had actually occurred. Language that suggested conclusions had already been reached while investigations were supposedly still ongoing. The inconsistencies were subtle. But they existed. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture became more complicated. What troubled Daniel most was not any single document. It was the quiet assumption behind them. The tone suggested that whoever created these reports believed the situation had already been settled in principle. Somewhere within the system, people appeared confident that the story surrounding Olivia would remain exactly as it had been written. Perhaps they believed Daniel would eventually accept the explanation offered to him. Perhaps they believed a father would grow tired of asking questions. Perhaps they believed that time alone would allow the situation to fade quietly into the background. But Daniel Whitaker was not interested in arguing with anyone. He was interested in clarity. Weeks passed, and the folder on his laptop continued expanding. Emails connected with meeting summaries. Administrative notes connected with internal memos. The timeline slowly revealed connections that had been invisible before. Then one evening, while reviewing a set of recently obtained documents, Daniel noticed something that made him stop reading. Near the bottom of one administrative record was a small detail that might escape most readers. A timestamp. At first glance, it looked routine. But when Daniel compared that timestamp with the timeline he had built, the significance became impossible to ignore. According to the official record, a decision regarding Olivia's situation had been entered into the school's internal system several days before the investigation process had supposedly begun. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Because that single timestamp meant only one thing. The outcome of the story surrounding his daughter had been decided long before anyone ever claimed to start searching for the truth. When people believe they control the story, they often expect resistance to come in predictable forms. They prepare for anger, arguments, emotional reactions, and loud attempts to defend reputations. Systems know how to handle those responses. They absorb them, label them, and quietly move forward unchanged. What systems rarely expect is patience. And patience, when paired with clarity, can quietly shift the entire balance of power. Daniel Whitaker understood this instinctively. The evening he discovered the timestamp discrepancy, he did not rush to call the school or send confrontational emails. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden demand for explanations. Instead, he closed his laptop slowly and sat in silence for several minutes, allowing the implications of that discovery to settle into place. Because the meaning was clear. If a decision had already been entered into the system before the investigation officially began, then the process surrounding Olivia had not been designed to discover the truth. It had been designed to confirm something that had already been decided. Daniel had no intention of reacting in a way that would make that process easier. The following days unfolded quietly, outwardly unchanged from the routines that had defined their lives before. Olivia continued attending school. Homework still spread across the kitchen table in the evenings. Conversations about college applications and future plans continued as they always had. But internally, Daniel had made a decision. Silence would be his strategy. Not silence born from fear or resignation, but silence chosen deliberately. The kind of quiet observation that allows a person to see more clearly while others assume nothing is happening. Each interaction with the school became part of that strategy. Emails were answered politely, but never emotionally. Meetings were attended with calm attentiveness. When administrators spoke about procedures and ongoing reviews, Daniel listened carefully, offering respectful responses that revealed nothing about the timeline he had already constructed privately. Behind the scenes, his documentation continued expanding. Every new email was added to the growing archive. Every meeting summary was written down immediately afterward. Dates, times, names, and exact wording were preserved with careful precision. The timeline had now grown detailed enough that Daniel could follow the sequence of events almost hour by hour. And as he studied that timeline, something interesting began revealing itself. Institutional behavior followed patterns. Conversations from administrators often repeated similar phrases, particularly when discussing responsibility and fairness. Certain explanations appeared carefully structured, as if designed to reassure parents that the system functioned properly. Yet those explanations rarely addressed specific details. Instead, they relied on general statements about policies, procedures, and professional judgment. During one meeting with school administrators, Daniel sat across from a small group of staff members inside a quiet conference room. The atmosphere remained calm, almost gentle in tone. A counselor spoke carefully about student well-being. An administrator described the importance of maintaining a safe environment for everyone involved. Their expressions remained composed. Their smiles were polite. From the outside, the conversation might appear thoughtful and responsible. But Daniel noticed something subtle beneath the surface. No one seemed worried. In fact, the confidence in the room suggested something else entirely. The administrators behaved like people who believed the situation had already been resolved in principle. Their explanations carried the calm assurance of individuals who expected the outcome to remain stable. Daniel thanked them for their time and asked only a few simple questions, all framed respectfully. He never mentioned the timeline he had built. He never referenced the timestamp discrepancy. And he never revealed how many documents now existed inside the private folder on his laptop. Because Daniel understood something that many people underestimate. Patience often reveals far more than confrontation. Meanwhile, Olivia continued navigating the subtle shifts around her at school. Some classmates avoided discussing the situation directly, while others spoke with cautious curiosity. Teachers maintained professional distance that sometimes felt unfamiliar. Daniel watched how these changes affected her. He did not fill their conversations with warnings or anger. Instead, he offered quiet reassurance, reminding her that integrity does not depend on public opinion. Truth has a slower pace, but it has a way of finding its path when given enough time. Weeks passed. With each passing day, Daniel's documentation became more detailed. What began as scattered records had now evolved into a structured timeline connecting emails, meeting notes, administrative reports, and internal references. And within that structure, inconsistencies continued appearing. Small contradictions between official explanations and documented actions. Subtle gaps in the sequence of events. Language suggesting conclusions had been reached before certain discussions had even taken place. Daniel did not rush to interpret these discoveries emotionally. He simply continued adding them to the record. From the perspective of those involved in the school administration, Daniel likely appeared cooperative and calm. A concerned father, certainly, but not someone preparing for a prolonged challenge. His quiet demeanor may have even reinforced their confidence that the situation would eventually settle without difficulty. What they did not realize was how carefully he had been paying attention from the very beginning. Late one evening, while reviewing several recently obtained documents connected to the administrative review process, Daniel noticed a reference number embedded inside one of the files. It pointed to an internal memo stored within the school's digital records. After a series of careful requests and procedural steps, the document eventually reached him. At first glance, the memo looked routine, written in the same professional tone used throughout the school's administrative communication. But as Daniel read the contents slowly, one sentence caused him to pause completely. Because the memo described an outcome. an outcome that had been outlined weeks earlier, long before the investigation process had supposedly begun. And in that moment, Daniel understood something with absolute clarity. The system had not simply misunderstood his daughter's situation. Someone had quietly decided the ending of her story before the facts were ever allowed to speak. When someone believes they can hurt a child and quietly control the story afterward, they usually rely on one powerful assumption, that no one will ever see the full picture. Systems are built in layers, and those layers often hide decisions behind procedures, meetings, and polite explanations. Most people only see the surface. But sometimes a single discovery begins pulling those layers apart, revealing how the story was shaped long before anyone asked what truly happened. Daniel Whitaker reached that moment late one evening while reviewing the growing archive of documents he had carefully assembled. The folder on his laptop had expanded into something far more detailed than it had been weeks earlier. Emails from administrators, meeting summaries, internal reports, and procedural documents now formed a long, organized timeline. Each item had been placed with patience, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to rush toward conclusions. Daniel had never approached the situation with the intention of proving anyone wrong. His only goal had been clarity. But clarity has a way of revealing uncomfortable truths. That night, Daniel focused on a set of internal communications that had been referenced indirectly in earlier paperwork. The documents were technical, written in the careful language institutions use when describing procedural matters. They mentioned reviews, coordination between departments, and policy considerations meant to guide decision-making. At first glance, nothing about them seemed unusual. Yet as Daniel read slowly, moving back and forth between different files, a pattern began emerging that had not been visible before. Certain decisions referenced in the administrative reports appeared connected to discussions that had taken place days earlier in separate internal communications. Those communications mentioned concerns about the school's public reputation, about maintaining consistency with past disciplinary actions, and about avoiding situations that might create unnecessary attention. The wording was cautious. But the meaning became clear. In complex institutions, protecting the structure of the system sometimes becomes more important than examining the experience of a single individual. Decisions are framed around stability, procedure, and precedent. And while those goals can sometimes protect fairness, they can also quietly overshadow the truth when mistakes begin to unfold. Daniel continued reading. A financial record appeared in one of the files, referencing a consultation with an external advisor connected to policy compliance. The consultation had occurred before the investigation into Olivia's situation had even begun. Its purpose, according to the document, was to ensure that the school's response aligned with broader administrative guidelines. Daniel sat back slightly, absorbing the implication. The consultation itself was not unusual. Institutions often seek guidance when navigating complicated situations. But in this case, the timing revealed something important. Conversations about how to manage the situation had begun before anyone had taken the time to fully understand what had actually happened to Olivia. As Daniel cross-referenced the financial document with earlier emails, another pattern appeared. Several internal messages between staff members discussed how the situation should be handled consistently. One message even referenced concerns about setting a precedent if the case were treated differently from previous incidents. The message never mentioned Olivia by name. But the context made it unmistakable. Daniel felt a quiet heaviness settle into his thoughts. For weeks he had suspected that the narrative surrounding his daughter had been shaped by assumptions rather than facts. Now the documentation suggested something deeper. The system had not simply misunderstood Olivia. It had quietly prioritized its own stability. Despite the weight of that realization, Daniel did not allow anger to guide his next steps. His expression remained calm as he continued organizing the documents. The timeline now stretched clearly from the earliest internal discussions to the official reports that had been shared publicly. What had once looked like scattered inconsistencies now formed a structured pattern. And patterns, once visible, are difficult to deny. Upstairs, Olivia was finishing her homework for the evening. When she came downstairs to refill her water glass, she noticed the quiet focus on her father's face. She hesitated for a moment before asking if everything was all right. Daniel closed the laptop gently and gave her the same reassuring smile he had offered throughout the entire process. He did not burden her with the full complexity of what he had discovered. Instead, he spoke calmly about something simpler. Truth takes time, he explained. But when people remain patient and careful, it eventually becomes clearer than any story someone tries to construct around it. Olivia listened quietly. For the first time in several weeks, the uncertainty in her expression softened slightly. The steady confidence in her father's voice carried something powerful, an assurance that the situation was being understood, even if the world around her still felt confusing. Daniel returned to his work later that evening, continuing to organize the growing collection of evidence. By now, the picture was far larger than a misunderstanding between a student and a school administration. It was a complex chain of decisions shaped by reputation, procedure, and the quiet pressure institutions often feel to protect themselves. Yet even within that complicated structure, the truth was beginning to emerge clearly. Each document connected to another. Each timestamp aligned with the timeline Daniel had carefully built. Each piece of communication revealed just a little more about how the story surrounding Olivia had been constructed. Then, as Daniel reviewed one final set of archived emails, his attention paused on a message that had been almost overlooked. The email was short, written weeks earlier during the earliest stage of the situation. Its tone was casual, almost routine. But one sentence stood out in a way that made Daniel read it twice. Because the message referenced the moment when the situation had first been brought to the administration's attention. And attached to that sentence was a name. The name of the person who had quietly initiated the entire narrative about Olivia from the very beginning. When people believe they have already controlled the story, they often become comfortable. That comfort is quiet but powerful. It appears in relaxed conversations, confident explanations, and polite smiles that carry the calm certainty of people who believe the outcome is already settled. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is not surrendering. Sometimes that person is simply waiting for the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. By the time Daniel Whitaker discovered the email that revealed who had initiated the narrative about Olivia, his understanding of the situation had changed completely. What had once seemed like scattered misunderstandings now formed a clear structure of decisions, conversations, and procedural steps that had quietly shaped the story surrounding his daughter. Daniel did not rush forward with the discovery. Instead, he began preparing something far more powerful than an emotional reaction. He began preparing clarity. The folder on his laptop was no longer just a collection of documents. It had become a carefully organized timeline that stretched across weeks of conversations, internal communications, and administrative records. Each piece of information had been placed in chronological order so that the sequence of events could be understood without confusion. Emails were matched with meeting notes. Reports were compared with internal communications. Timestamps were aligned with procedural announcements. Slowly, patiently, Daniel assembled a narrative built not from accusations but from documented reality. What he created was not an argument. It was a timeline. And timelines have a way of revealing truths that individual explanations cannot hide. Meanwhile, the world around him continued moving forward as if the situation had already been resolved. At school, administrators spoke with the same calm professionalism they had maintained from the beginning. Conversations about student well-being continued in measured tones. Meetings occurred inside conference rooms where polished language and reassuring explanations filled the air. During one such meeting, Daniel sat quietly across the table from several administrators while they described the school's commitment to fairness and responsible procedures. Their tone remained warm and composed. Every sentence sounded thoughtful and carefully constructed. Daniel listened attentively. He thanked them for their time. And he left the meeting without challenging a single statement. From their perspective, his calm behavior likely reinforced their confidence that the situation had been contained. Perhaps they believed that time had softened his concerns. Perhaps they assumed that the complexity of the system had made it difficult for him to see the larger picture. What they could not see was the growing clarity taking shape behind the scenes. Back at home, Daniel continued refining the timeline with patient precision. Each document was labeled with the exact date it had been created. Each communication was placed in sequence with the events it referenced. Even the smallest details were preserved carefully, because Daniel understood that clarity depends on accuracy. The process required patience. There were evenings when the work stretched late into the night while the house remained quiet around him. Olivia would occasionally pass through the room on her way upstairs, offering a gentle smile that carried both trust and curiosity. Daniel never allowed the situation to become a source of fear for her. Instead, he reassured her through presence rather than explanation. Life continued moving forward with steady routines, conversations about her future, and moments of normalcy that protected her sense of stability. Slowly, Olivia began regaining the quiet confidence that had always defined her. She could see the calm focus in her father's actions. Even without knowing every detail, she sensed that something meaningful was unfolding with patience and care. Meanwhile, within the school administration, nothing appeared to be changing. Conversations continued with professional ease. Reports were discussed with the same institutional confidence. The narrative surrounding Olivia remained largely unchallenged in public discussions. But beneath that surface, the quiet preparation was approaching its final stage. Daniel understood that presenting information too early could allow explanations to be reshaped or dismissed. Timing mattered as much as evidence itself. The documentation had to reach the right place, at the right moment, in a form that could not be easily ignored. So he waited. And while he waited, the timeline continued strengthening. The internal memo that had described an outcome before the investigation had begun was now placed at the center of the sequence. Around it were the earlier emails discussing policy concerns, the consultation record showing administrative preparation, and the report that had eventually reached Olivia. Together, they told a story very different from the one the school had presented. Weeks of careful work had transformed scattered records into a single, clear chain of evidence. One evening, while reviewing the timeline again to ensure nothing had been overlooked, Daniel noticed that a small reference number appeared in one of the internal documents he had previously obtained. It pointed to a procedural file connected to the administrative review process. Daniel followed the reference through the proper request channels, patiently completing the necessary steps required to access the file. Days passed. Then, one quiet afternoon, the requested document finally arrived. At first glance, it appeared routine, formatted in the same professional style used throughout the school's internal system. But as Daniel began reading, the significance of what he was seeing became unmistakable. Because this document did something the others had only suggested. It confirmed the entire sequence. The dates aligned perfectly with the timeline he had built. The language acknowledged discussions that had taken place before any investigation was formally announced. And within its carefully written paragraphs was the final confirmation that connected every piece of evidence Daniel had gathered. For the first time since the situation began, the full chain of proof was complete. People expect truth to arrive loudly. They imagine dramatic confrontations, raised voices, and emotional moments where someone finally demands justice. But in reality, truth often moves differently. It arrives quietly through documents, procedures, and facts that no longer allow the old story to survive. And when that moment comes, the shift is rarely explosive. It is simply undeniable. By the time Daniel Whitaker completed the final timeline, he already understood something important. This situation would not be resolved through confrontation. The evidence he had gathered did not need drama. It only needed the right path to reach the right place. So he chose calm, official channels. The documentation he had assembled was organized into a clear and methodical report. Every email was attached in chronological order. Meeting summaries were included exactly as they had been recorded. Administrative memos appeared beside the reports that referenced them. The timestamp discrepancy that had first raised concern now sat clearly within the sequence of events. Nothing in the report accused anyone directly. Instead, the documents simply told the story themselves. Daniel submitted the full timeline through the appropriate district review process, the same system designed to examine procedural concerns when families believed something had gone wrong. The submission contained no emotional language. Only facts, dates, and records carefully aligned with one another. Once the documents entered the system, the process began moving forward quietly. At first, nothing appeared different within the school community. Classes continued as usual. Teachers moved through their lessons. Students gathered in hallways between periods, discussing everyday concerns that had nothing to do with administrative reviews happening quietly behind closed doors. But inside the district offices, the documentation was being examined carefully. Administrators reviewing the timeline could see the same pattern Daniel had discovered weeks earlier. Internal discussions had occurred before the investigation was announced. Policy consultations had been arranged before evidence had been gathered. Reports had been written in ways that assumed conclusions already existed. The sequence was difficult to dismiss. Soon, requests for clarification began reaching the school administration. At first they appeared as routine inquiries, requests for context about specific documents, explanations for certain timestamps, confirmation of procedural steps that had been taken during the review process. But as the questions continued, something subtle began changing. The calm confidence that had once surrounded the situation slowly began to shift. Inside the school offices, administrators who had previously spoken about the matter with composed certainty now found themselves revisiting earlier decisions. Documents were reviewed again. Meeting notes were examined with new attention. Because the timeline revealed something they could not easily explain. Certain decisions had indeed appeared before the investigation process had begun. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. Daniel remained exactly where he had always been throughout the process, calm, respectful, and silent. He did not call the school demanding updates. He did not speak publicly about the situation. He continued living his daily routine with the same steady patience that had guided him from the beginning. At home, Olivia noticed small changes first. Teachers who had previously maintained careful distance began interacting with her more normally again. Conversations in the hallway no longer carried the same cautious undertones. A counselor who had once spoken with measured concern now approached her with a gentler tone, asking how she had been managing during the past few weeks. None of these changes were dramatic. But they were real. The narrative that had quietly surrounded her was beginning to soften. Within the district's review process, the documentation continued moving through the appropriate procedures. Each step involved verifying records, confirming timelines, and ensuring that institutional policies had been followed correctly. The more carefully the timeline was examined, the clearer the sequence became. Eventually, a revised report was issued acknowledging procedural irregularities in the handling of Olivia's situation. The language remained professional and careful, but its meaning was unmistakable. The earlier conclusions had been reached prematurely. Additional review had revealed that several assumptions made during the initial process were not supported by the available evidence. Gradually, the official record began correcting itself. Olivia's name, which had once been quietly associated with a troubling narrative, was now being placed back into its proper context. The administrative file surrounding her case was updated to reflect the new findings. Teachers were informed that earlier concerns had been reassessed. No announcement was made. No public apology was delivered through dramatic statements. Instead, the truth simply replaced the old story. And because the correction happened through official documentation, it carried a quiet authority that rumors could not compete with. For Olivia, the change felt almost surreal. The tension she had carried for weeks slowly began to dissolve as normal life returned around her. Friends spoke with her the same way they always had. Teachers once again recognized the focused student they had known before the situation began. Through it all, Daniel never sought recognition for what he had done. He attended one final administrative meeting where district officials thanked him for his patience and cooperation during the review process. The conversation remained calm and professional, focused on ensuring that future procedures would prevent similar situations from occurring again. Daniel simply nodded, listening quietly. Because for him, the goal had never been personal victory. It had always been about restoring the truth for his daughter. As the meeting concluded, one administrator paused while reviewing the documentation Daniel had submitted weeks earlier. The timeline. The emails. The careful notes attached to each stage of the process. A thoughtful expression crossed the administrator's face as a realization slowly settled in. Because the first recorded document in Daniel Whitaker's timeline had been created on the very day the unusual paperwork first appeared. Which meant something remarkable. Long before the investigation had even begun, Daniel Whitaker had already started collecting the evidence that would eventually reveal the entire story. When people believe they can control the story, they rarely imagine that the ending might unfold without noise. They expect resistance to arrive loudly. They expect anger, conflict, and public battles over reputation. But sometimes the most powerful correction happens quietly. Sometimes truth returns not as a dramatic victory, but as a steady restoration of balance that slowly replaces what was never accurate to begin with. In the weeks that followed the district review, the atmosphere around Olivia Whitaker began changing in ways that were both subtle and meaningful. Nothing happened all at once. There were no dramatic announcements in the school auditorium and no public statements that forced attention onto the situation. Instead, the corrections moved carefully through the system that had once allowed the misunderstanding to grow. Administrative policies were reviewed. Procedural guidelines were updated. Certain internal practices were quietly adjusted to ensure that future investigations followed clearer timelines before conclusions were documented. These changes appeared in official language inside internal reports and policy meetings. To the outside world, they looked like ordinary administrative improvements. But those who had followed Olivia's situation closely understood what they represented. A system acknowledging that something had gone wrong. Reputations inside the school community shifted gradually. Some individuals who had once spoken with confident certainty now adopted a quieter tone when discussing procedural decisions. Conversations became more reflective, less certain about assumptions that had previously seemed unquestionable. Accountability did not arrive with accusations or punishments. Instead, it appeared through awareness. The realization that processes must be handled with patience, fairness, and careful attention to truth. Meanwhile, Olivia's life slowly returned to the rhythm that had once felt so natural. At school, teachers once again saw the thoughtful, focused student they had known before the situation began. Academic opportunities that had briefly seemed uncertain opened again as counselors helped her move forward with college preparation. Conversations about environmental science programs and scholarship applications filled the kitchen table in the evenings. The uncertainty that had once clouded her confidence began dissolving. There were still moments when she reflected on the weeks that had passed, moments when the memory of confusion lingered quietly in her thoughts. But those memories no longer carried the same weight. They had been replaced by something steadier. Understanding. She had learned that truth does not always defend itself immediately. Sometimes it requires patience, courage, and the quiet strength of someone willing to protect it until it finds its voice. Throughout all of this, Daniel Whitaker remained exactly the person he had been from the beginning. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. He did not correct rumors with dramatic explanations or seek recognition for the role he had played in restoring clarity. When neighbors occasionally mentioned hearing that the situation at the school had been resolved, Daniel simply nodded politely and changed the subject. For him, the outcome had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about protecting his daughter's dignity. One evening several months later, Daniel sat on the front porch watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the quiet neighborhood. The same streets that had once carried the quiet tension of uncertainty now felt peaceful again. Children rode bicycles past the house, their laughter echoing through the warm air. Inside the house, Olivia was preparing an application essay for one of the universities she hoped to attend. Her voice drifted gently through the open window as she discussed ideas with a friend over the phone. The confidence in her tone was unmistakable. Daniel listened quietly, a small, thoughtful smile appearing as he realized how far they had both come since the first unusual document had appeared on the kitchen counter. The world had not changed dramatically. The same houses stood along the street. The same school continued operating with its daily routines. Life had returned to the familiar patterns that make communities feel stable. Yet something important had shifted beneath the surface. For those who had been involved in the situation, a quiet lesson remained. Stories can be written quickly, but truth has a longer memory. Institutions may move slowly, but when patience meets clarity, even the most confident narratives can unravel. Daniel never described what he had done as strategy. To him, it had simply been observation, discipline, and timing. He had trusted that careful attention to detail would eventually reveal what needed to be seen. And once the truth became visible, it had spoken clearly enough on its own. Months later, during a routine district policy meeting, one administrator briefly mentioned the case that had led to several procedural changes earlier that year. The conversation was calm and professional, focused on improving future practices rather than revisiting past mistakes. But as the discussion concluded, one quiet realization lingered among those present. Throughout the entire process, while meetings had been held, reports written, and assumptions quietly accepted, one person had remained silent. Not passive. Not unaware. Simply patient. And in the end, the quietest person in the room had been the one guiding the story back toward the truth all along.